Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little darker than my usual bedtime tales. The complete history of methamphetamine, the so-called super soldier drug that once promised relentless energy and became one of the most destructive substances of the modern era. Forget the glossy TV myths and the idea of a miraculous stimulant. This is a story of wartime experiments, scientific ambition, ruthless markets, and human lives steadily unravelling. The truth is, if you were dropped into any chapter of its rise, on a battlefield where it was handed out as a boost, in a lab where chemistry met commerce, or in a community left to cope with its aftermath, you'd quickly see how fragile the line is between promise and catastrophe. If you're enjoying this, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I'm always fascinated by the variety of places people are watching from. Now, dim the lights, and let's step into tonight's journey together. The tale begins quietly and far from the laboratories and barracks that would later become its stages, among the small wiry shrubs that push out of the dry soil of Inner Asia and northern China. Ephedra, Ma Huang in the text that curators and herbalists kept on their shelves, smelled of the dry heat of the steppes when it was boiled down, astringent and astringently simple, the steam carrying a nasal clarity that people prized above all in winters and in dusty caravans. For millennia, that steam was a medicine in the way a warm blanket is a medicine, modest, local, and folk-wise effective. The physicians of the Han Dynasty wrote of Mahuang as a remedy for cough and congestion. Later herbal compendia advised decoctions for asthma, for colds, for the fogged senses of fever. What those compendia did not imagine was that within a leaf and a twig lay a molecule that could be plucked and turned into an instrument of relentless wakefulness. In the late 19th century, a Japanese chemist named Nagai Nagayoshi worked with that instrument as one works with a stubborn, interesting toy in the dim afternoon of an idle room. Nagai, trained in Japan's modernizing laboratories, opened Mahuang to the analytic eye that a new chemical science was bringing to natural products. In the mid-1880s, he isolated the alkaloid ephedrine from the plant, and in doing so he executed the small miracle that pharmacology had been promising since alchemy turned orderly, the conversion of a traditional remedy into a single, reproducible chemical entity. By naming and isolating ephedrine, he did something that in the long run mattered far more than the extraction itself. He placed a botanical truth on the ledger of synthetic possibility. Once a compound is known, chemists across continents can see it, test it, tinker with it. They can imagine relatives and rivals. They can and they did make new molecules. The path from ephedrine to methamphetamine is, in one sense, a short chemical one. In another sense, it is a long story of laboratories and travel, of papers exchanged by post, of the clatter of patent offices and the quiet hum of industrial presses. Nagai's work, his careful separation of plant alkaloids, entered the literature of organic chemistry, and that literature moved through the networks of the age. The journals and conferences that link Tokyo to Berlin and London, professors to their students, corporations to their in-house researchers. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a period when the chemistry of alkaloids became a respectable, measurable business. The industrial appetite for isolable, patentable molecules was growing brisk. Companies were eager for new sympathometics, new bronchodilators, new tonics to sell to physicians faced with modern conditions, sleep disorders, urban fatigue, nasal congestion in the cities that were getting busier and drier by the year. It was in this context that a second Japanese chemist, Akira Ogata, refined what had been a curious laboratory sketch into a form fit for a pill bottle. Around 1919, Ogata found a practical way to produce a crystalline hydrochloride form of the compound that, when properly dosed, produced stimulant effects. That crystallization is more than a piece of lab craft. It is the moment a molecule becomes fungible, easy to weigh, easy to ship, and therefore easy to sell. A freebase that is oily and temperamental is an object of academic interest. A crystalline salt that sits in a vial, like a tiny white promise, is something for the commerce pages. Suddenly, The pathway from Ma Huang to mattress and market was literal: a plant, an isolated alkaloid, a laboratory conversion, and a stable salt that could be counted on in the pharmacy. Science did not proceed in a vacuum. The Meiji and Taisho periods in Japan had linked the island's chemists into a transnational conversation with their European colleagues, and a globalizing pharmaceutical industry in Europe and the United States was hungry for compounds that promised both novelty and novelty's twin, proprietary control. Patenting practices in the early 20th century had matured out of 19th century industrialization. Firms sought not only to discover but to own, to brand, to advertise. The chemistry that Nagai and Ogata practiced, therefore, touched the legal and commercial frameworks of their day. A crystalline salt could be patented in multiple jurisdictions. A patent conferred not just exclusivity, but the language of legitimacy for marketing departments seeking to claim a place in physicians' cupboards. Markets were ready. The first decades of the 20th century made people into consumers of not only food and clothing, but also of sleep and attention. Hospitals and clinics were adapting to new diagnostic categories. Doctors were tasked with curating modern life under the pressure of industrial rhythms and wartime exigencies. Pharmaceutical companies, some small, some already multinational, smelled opportunity. They had learned how to take a fixed formula, wrap it in a trade name, and deliver it to the doctor as a reliable instrument. The chemistry did the rest. A mojito of laboratory inventory and entrepreneurial zeal turned a natural remedy into a compound that could be produced at scale, stamped with a trademark, and pushed into the lanes of medicine and daily life. By the 30s, that push gathered speed. The pill-by-pill transformation from a laboratory curiosity to medicine occurred under the attentive eye of advertising and the less coercive force of professional endorsement. In clinics and in print, the new stimulant was presented as a treatment for specific modern complaints: narcolepsy, the sudden and dangerous collapse into sleep, depression, the languor that modern life sometimes brought, obesity, the social and clinical problem that many physicians and patients were addressing with appetite suppressants, and the perennial nuisance of nasal congestion, which factories and cities had not managed to cure by legislation or ventilation. Pharmaceutical firms, always ready with a trade name and a tagline, rolled out products with the assuredness of those who had learned the rules of the market. Names were chosen for their genteel promise: Methadrin in the English-speaking world, Philipon in Japan, Pervitin in Germany. They were presented as precise shots of chemical clarity, small diamonds of function that doctors could drop into a patient's regimen. The commercial practices of the day mattered to how these molecules were perceived. Firms trained sales representatives to visit physicians' offices, to leave specimens and samples in pockets and drawers, to speak the correct jargon about dosing and indications. The representative from a pharmaceutical company would offer a booklet of clinical studies, anecdotal as they often were, and a few personal endorsements from doctors in respected hospitals. Advertising took another route, reaching directly into the patient-practitioner triad through medical journals and, in some countries, consumer pages. There were glossy ads and small, sober notices. There were case studies that claimed dramatic results in a handful of patients and implied that the rest of medicine simply had not been paying attention. The medical culture of the 1930s and 1940s was gently credulous in a way that later decades would not be. Physicians were trained to act, to intervene. They had in many clinics fewer options for persistent fatigue and mood than we imagine today. The diagnostic categories themselves were more fluid. Neurasthenia was still in pay at many medical schools. Melancholia had beds in asylums and outpatient clinics, and many sufferers of what we might now call clinical depression received stimulant prescriptions because stimulants worked quickly, and quick results were a currency physicians liked. The immediate relief of mental fog or the rapid loss of appetite in a patient intent on shedding weight were visible, measurable outcomes. The long-term consequences were less easily tabulated in the short-term clinical trial. Truly enormous forces pushed prescriptions into normal practice. The Great Depression had, perversely, increased appetite for the small medical miracles that suggested energy without rest. Factories asked for workers who could stay awake, Offices wanted alert clerks, and homemakers wanted an edge to manage the unrelenting chores of modern domestic life. Doctors who specialized in psychiatry and in general practice learned to write prescriptions for their patients and for themselves. Tonics became a legitimate therapeutic category. There was also an ease in the regulatory frameworks of many countries. Before the rigorous controls of the post-war era, many stimulants were available with a physician's signature or even over the counter in some formulations. The absence of modern pharmacovigilance meant that clinical practice could evolve by habit more than by evidence. Marketing worked hand in glove with prescribing. Advertisements for weight loss leaned heavily on the aesthetic and social anxieties of the time. Magazines carried before and after pictures and testimonies that read like the testimonials of later diet cultures. Medical journals printed controlled trials, small and often short-term, that verified appetite suppression and mood elevation. Sales representatives left samples in the hands of physicians and sometimes in the waiting rooms where anxious patients might find them and ask for the new promise by name. A pill that let a woman downsize could be described as therapeutic. A tablet that kept a night shift binding clerk awake could be prescribed as pragmatic. Dependence was a word that had not yet consolidated its current clinical specificity. Habit and overuse were words used only in passing in the small studies and case reports that appeared in specialty journals. Elsewhere in the world, pharmaceuticalization took different forms that reflected local industry and local desires. In Japan, Philipon appeared on the market, distributed by industrial-scale manufacturers, and it seeped into both medicine cabinets and the wider labour pool. In the United States, the family of amphetamines, cousins to methamphetamine, appeared under trade names and in inhalers. Firms like SmithKline and French had already learned how to take a stimulant and make it a standard product for nasal decongestion and for the management of attention and wakefulness in specific conditions. Physicians wrote for tablets as they had once written for bromides and for barbiturates, with a sense that one was using an available tool in the clinical score of options. The adverts assured safety. The rhetoric was one of control, not surrender. The blind spot was not simply ideology. Research that tracked long-term outcomes lagged behind marketing cycles, and the penalties of chronic stimulant use, dependence, tolerance, mood instability, appetite disruption, matured on a timeline longer than the advertising budgets. Early signals came in the form of case reports and correspondence among physicians. Accounts of palpitations, of insomnia that outlasted the intended prescription, of irritability and elevated hostility crossed desks in hospitals and in pharmaceutical firms. But these reports arrived like small waves against a large current of legitimate therapeutic use. It takes time for a culture, a profession, a regulatory body, a market, to pivot from widespread acceptance to cautious skepticism. The pivot accelerated when the laboratories and the showrooms where stimulants had been sold intersected with militaries that needed bodies to move, to stay awake, to perform beyond the ordinary hours and overnight. The Second World War offered a stage on which the promises of stimulant chemistry could be tested at scale. If a pill could keep a pilot awake through a night mission, then the tactical and operational advantages were immediate and obvious to those planning campaigns. If a tablet could keep a soldier marching without sleep, the tempo of an army could, in theory, be sustained at levels that the enemy might not be prepared for. The pharmacology of wakefulness became a component of strategy. Germany early and energetically seized that component. The Berlin pharmaceutical firm Temmler Werke, a modest company that had entered the market with a stimulant product, produced and trademarked Pervitin in the late 1930s. Pervitin, a methamphetamine preparation, was sold first in the German civilian market as a stimulant for fatigue, a remedy for concentration, a small chemical sun to brighten grey days. Then the Wehrmacht took notice. In 1939 and into 1940, during the campaigns that opened the war in Europe, invasions of Poland and then the lightning campaigns through the Low Countries and France in the spring of 1940, Pervitin found its way into the logistical lists of the German army. Soldiers were issued tablets to keep them alert during long drives in the cold, to make night marches possible, to sustain the tempo central to the Blitzkrieg doctrine that emphasized movement and surprise. The logic was as stark as it was seductive. Speed wins battles. Speed requires attention and the willing endurance of soldiers. Stimulants provide endurance. Military planners in Germany and elsewhere believed they had found a modern mechanical advantage that would not show itself on a map or a balance sheet in the same way as tanks or bullets, but would be real in the timing of an advance and the distances troops could cover without sleep. Pervitin made whole nights into days. It made hunger less pressing. It reduced the number of fewer rest halts, and logistics officers drew up supply lists that included boxes of pills in the same breath they listed rations and munitions. Scale here matters. What had been a pharmacy item in city windows suddenly became a logistical commodity. Temmler's production expanded, and the Wehrmacht's requisitioning bureaucracy adapted. Small metal tins and paper envelopes of tablets were packed into field kits and medics' chests. Supply officers counted tablets like bullets. The distribution patterns show the seriousness with which the military adopted chemical aids. The tablets were present not only in special units but across a swath of forces: panzer crews, infantry on forced marches, radio operators, and bomber pilots. The result, in the very short term, was an increase in operational tempo and a capacity to carry out 24-hour operations with diminished emphasis on rest cycles, Stewars. This was not a unilateral phenomenon of the Axis. Allied forces, facing their own logistical and tactical dilemmas, made similar pragmatic choices, though often with different pharmacological preferences. British pilots and air crews, including in the RAF during the Battle of Britain and in subsequent air campaigns, used amphetamines, benzodrine inhalers and later tablets to ward off sleep on long missions. The United States military, confronted with the same need to keep SE crews and ground troops alert, authorized the use of stimulants in carefully defined circumstances. In Japan, Philippon went from the civilian market into the factories and the military, where authorities saw in a stimulant both a productivity tool and a way to weather wartime privations. In short, stimulants became part of the suite of tools a modern army could deploy to bend human limits. Drugs, rations, training and technology all blended in the calculus of victory. The human costs, when they became visible, did not glow so much as accumulate like tiny debts on a ledger. Field reports from medicine officers in the Wehrmacht noted incidents of hallucination, of aggression, of breakdowns that local doctors suspected were linked to heavy and prolonged use of Pervitin. There were operational consequences: soldiers with impaired judgment, whose risk assessment was skewed by stimulant-driven confidence, units that suffered from a rashness that compromised discipline. Some commanders became concerned not about the immediate loss of sleep, but about the erosion of command and control when troops, fueled by stimulants, took risks without the sober pause that rest would provide. The very attribute that commanders had welcomed, diminished fatigue, could, in excess, produce mistakes. The medical community around the armies began to recognise patterns: addiction and withdrawal, psychosis precipitated by prolonged high doses, and the simple arithmetic of tolerance. A soldier who needed one tablet to march for a day might need two for the next. The supply chain would be forced to meet that escalation, and logistics would be drawn into a feedback loop that made armies dependent on pharmaceutical supply as much as on fuel. Where supply faltered, the effects could be as tactical as any shortage of food or ammunition. The super soldier thus revealed an Achilles heel. The enhancement was itself dependent on continuous supply, and it shifted strategic calculations toward the vulnerability of the pill train. There were reports and eventual policy responses. German military medical authorities, faced with rising case reports of dependence and with anecdotal evidence that stimulant use could degrade unit cohesion, attempted to regulate and to limit distribution as the war dragged on and casualties and supply stresses grew. The initial enthusiasm cooled in some quarters into caution. In Britain and in the United States, where amphetamines had been distributed to meet similar needs, medical officers were aware of come-downs and of mood swings that followed stimulant use, and they counselled moderation even where operational necessity required some use. The wartime calculus was not simply morale, it was pragmatic. The question became not whether stimulants could elevate a soldier's endurance for a single night's mission. They did, but whether reliance on them could be sustained without undermining fighting capacity over campaigns measured in months and years. Beyond the battlefield, the presence of stimulants in wartime life altered societies. In occupied and allied countries alike, pills circulated in home fronts as much as in foxholes. Industrial managers in wartime economies flirted with Philippon and similar products as a way to keep production lines moving through air raids and blackouts. Civilian populations, facing rationing and round-the-clock work, sometimes reached for stimulants as a last reliable energy source. The boundary between therapeutic use and performance enhancement blurred. The term doping was not yet a household reproach in the way it became later. There is a quiet irony in the story, one that tastes faintly of the dark humour historians sometimes allow themselves when noting that the hubris of modernity often dresses itself in small tablets. The same chemistry that isolated ephedrine from a shrub on a slope in Inner Asia had moved in a few decades into the pockets of soldiers and the briefcases of executives, into advertising copy, and into the margins of medical journals. The laboratory's crystalline product promised focus, swiftness, and a discipline of tempo that strategists coveted. The pill was, in the moment, a tactical instrument as much as a therapeutic one. But instruments have costs. They require supply, oversight, and prudence. The adoption of methamphetamine and its cousins across the interwar and wartime decades reveals the modern state's negotiation with human limits. We can extend wakefulness and endurance. We can modify appetite and mood, but we do so at the price of creating dependencies and logistical vulnerabilities that a campaign planner and a public health official must weigh. The pharmacological promise of the super soldier evaporated in the face of operational data that showed its limits. The moral and medical costs that were obscured in sales meetings and in early clinical trials came into view on the wards and in the reports of regimental surgeons. So the story folded back on itself. The molecule that began its public life in a herbal steam inhalation moved into laboratories and out into markets, and then into the centres of power where strategy is made. It performed admirably in short, dazzling bursts of performance, and then it left behind patterns of dependence and fields of second-order problems, supply lines that could be cut, units that required ever more tablets to function, and individuals who suffered downstream consequences that medicine and society were slow to catalogue. In the microcosm of a pill's journey, from shrub to clinic to battlefield, we see the interplay of curiosity, commerce and control that characterises much of 20th century medical history. What begins as an answer to a problem of attention becomes, in aggregate, an ethical and logistical question about what societies will give up in the name of endurance. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world that had taken stimulants to stay awake was finally still, the rooms where those decisions had been made, the hospital offices, the military planning rooms, the corporate boardrooms, filled with a different sound, the sound of consequences accumulating like unread dispatches. The chemical that promised to make men into machines instead made them into dependents of a supply system. And once the supply broke, the fiction of the super soldier showed itself in full. A soldier could be faster, sharper, and then suddenly less reliable if the pill that had been his engine was not there when needed. The strategic calculus had always been more complicated than the marketing had allowed. There is a soft, bitter humour in the arithmetic. A drug that promised to outpace fatigue required an entire logistics wing to stay effective. A campaign that could be accelerated with a few pills required additional convoys to bring the pills. The laboratory's quiet triumph had set in motion a new set of needs that militaries and societies were obliged to meet. The grand illusion of instantaneous human enhancement colliding with the grinding reality of supply and of human biology is an old theme. Speed only reveals the next bottleneck. In this case, the bottleneck was human. The super soldier became, in time, an army of people who required more than adrenaline. They required rest, care, and a supply chain that an exhausted nation could not always promise. The story of methamphetamine's early life, from the powdery smells of ancient apothecaries to the clean-lined bottles of interwar medicine, and onward into the field kits of modern armies, is thus a parable of modernisation. It shows how small laboratory histories can become national strategies, and how medical cultures, advertising practices, and military logistics can align to make a promising compound into a global phenomenon. The chemistry was elegant, the commerce was nimble, the strategy was tempting, the costs unfolded, slowly at first and then more clearly, in reports and in the quiet of hospital wards, and in the post-war reckonings that would change how societies regulated such substances. And so, in the hush after the campaigns and the clinching of treaties, the world began to see what had been done. The very same molecules that had carried people through nights of urgency also left traces of consequence in the lives of those who had used them. It is a lesson the modern age learned in fits and starts, that the power to alter attention and appetite is not merely a technical triumph, but a social force that changes how work is organised, how war is conducted, and how medicine is practised. The shrub on the step had been simple. The consequences, like any true nocturne, were complicated and long. The crates did not so much arrive as unwind themselves into civilian life, as if the seams of war had simply loosened and let loose whatever the bellies of armies had once held. In the late 1940s and the 1950s, the boxes that had been stamped and stacked for blitzkrieg runouts and imperial last resort pushes found new freight forwarders, pharmacies, factory dispensaries, company doctors' cabinets. The stimulant that had been enlisted to sharpen soldiers' vision and steady hands, once christened for 1,000 pragmatic purposes under names like Pervitin or Philipon in Europe and East Asia, Benzedrine and Dexedrine on American shelves, returned home in blunt, banal forms. In Britain, a tired shift worker could still be offered an amphetamine to keep the lamps burning. In the United States, mothers of the post-war boom were whispered weight-loss cures that smelled faintly of industry and aerodromes. In Japan, the residue of wartime distribution fed a black market that soon became a public health problem by the end of the decade. What the drug had been for empires, it would now become for economies. A commodity repurposed, repackaged, normalised. Normalisation feels like a small mercy when the rest of the world is rebuilding. The pills were bright, the ads reassuring, and the science smelled like laboratories and progress. Physicians, stretched thin by the demands of demobilisation and the flood of new patients with new ailments, reached for stimulants as reliable instruments to treat narcolepsy, to counter melancholia, to lift the languor of the chronically tired. Easy diagnoses, easy cures, efficient pills. Across the mid-century Anglophone press, the image of the PEP tablet grew domestic wings. Dexedrine, Benzedrine, the names were almost friendly. They promised punctuality, alertness, an extra hour for housewives, truckers, students and typists who were paid in productivity rather than in sleep. Pharmacists dispensed these tablets with a sort of anxious enthusiasm, and patients took them with the innocent confidence of those who trust labels and clinical trials. The street smell of after-work cafes and late-night garages carried the faint tang of stimulant commerce long after the war flags came down. But as the glow of convenience spread, small shadows grew on the margins of case studies and clinical reports. By the 1950s and into the 1960s, psychiatrists and neurologists in hospitals from London to Los Angeles were cataloguing patterns that did not fit the brochure song. Dependency, tolerance, the peculiar delirium known as amphetamine psychosis. The term itself is clinical and unromantic, but behind it were nights of paranoia and violence, weeks of sleepless descent and cognitive erosion, patients who had taken promises and found new prisons. Epidemiologists began to collate this clinical unease into population-level data, where availability was high. So were admissions for stimulant-related disorders. Where prescription controls were lax, so too was the shadow economy that sold surreptitious pills in vending spots and under-the-table pharmacies. In Tokyo and Osaka, the black market circulation of Philipon reached epidemic proportions in the late 1940s and 1950s, a social problem so visible that it demanded a legislative response. In the United States, the image of the benevolent medical small dose was eroded slowly by headlines and coroner's reports. In the United Kingdom, the National Health Service and professional bodies began to issue cautious guidance. Regulation is seldom a single clean cut. It is accretion, a council here, a prohibition there, a binding convention adopted at the United Nations. The global architecture that would come to constrain stimulants unfolded in stages, and with the leisurely bureaucracy of diplomacy and post-war prudence. The Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961 had consolidated controls on opiates and coca, but it was the Bond Convention on Psychotropic Substances that would formally bring amphetamines and methamphetamine under a modern international scheduling regime. That treaty, negotiated as the second wave of the UN's attempt to globalize drug policy, reflected an uneasy consensus. Substances that had legitimate medical uses would be regulated, but their non-medical circulation would be criminalized. Nations often reluctantly signed on. Before that international milestone, national levers had already begun to move. In the United States, the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 reshaped the federal regulatory landscape, classifying drugs into schedules and remaking the legal ground on which prescription and manufacture stood. The Drug Enforcement Administration followed in 1973 to police the new order. Japan enacted stringent stimulant control measures in the early 1950s as it confronted the Philippine crisis, and in many European nations the post-war years brought progressively tighter prescriptions, packet accounting, and licensing regimes for manufacturers and distributors. What these measures achieved, in part, was a narrowing of legitimate channels. Production and distribution for approved medical and industrial uses continued, but the paperwork and oversight increased. Manufacturers had to account for batches. Pharmacies kept more detailed logs. Prescribing doctors faced professional attention and occasionally legal jeopardy. That narrowing was intended at once to protect patients and to dry up illicit supply. History teaches us, however, that demand is a stubborn river. Where you dam it, it finds new channels. Medical caution, epidemiological evidence, and the moral authority of international treaty regimes did what they could. They distilled a truth that had been murmuring in clinics and emergency rooms. This family of drugs could do genuine therapeutic good and genuine social harm. Governments halfway between paternalism and liberalism chose control. The consequence, predictable to any student of markets, was that an underground economy would grow to take advantage of the opportunities that regulation create. The economy that grew was both small and enormous. In the beginning there were domestic kitchens, garages, and motel rooms where clandestine manufacture took place on a scale adapted to local demand, small, nimble, imperfect. The products were sold in angry little markets, highways and dime stores, sex work corridors and farm co-ops. These labs were hazardous, of course, leaky with chemicals and secrecy, and for every small operation there were busts that made local news. But smallness has an advantage when the aim is to evade detection. It also had an economic logic that suited the pockets of rural America, outlying towns in Australia, and neighbourhoods in post-industrial Europe. The cash yields were significant relative to other local economic options. Unemployment and marginalisation provided a steady stream of cheap labour and low-opportunity entrepreneurship. A meth lab in a trailer on the edge of a town could produce a month's wages for a family under conditions that, if discovered, would lead to eviction, environmental remediation costs, and sometimes prison. The moral calculus was raw and practical. For some, the meth economy was not a chosen vice, but a chosen survival technique. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, economic incentives began to reshape production geographies. The United States, where rural meth labs became notorious in states like Missouri, Arkansas, and parts of the Midwest, saw a dramatic rise in production and a shifting composition of the market. Powdered amphetamine forms were complemented by crystalline methamphetamine, a product with a higher perceived purity and a longer shelf life that was especially suitable for smoking, the consumption ritual that reinforced regular use and potent craving. Meanwhile, producers in Mexico, initially exporters of marijuana and heroin, found meth to be a profitable adjunct. Cartels that already had cross-border smuggling infrastructures and access to capital began to invest in larger production facilities, what journalists and officials would come to call superlabs. These superlabs were not the domestic improvisations of earlier decades. They were industrial operations with the capacity to process precursor inflows into multi-ton outputs for regional and international distribution. The logistics were straightforward in their basics. Bulk chemicals required bulk movement. Bulk movement favoured ports, trucking routes, corrupt intermediaries who could smooth shipments through customs, and territories where local authority could be bribed or coerced. The cartels deployed those mechanisms with the same corporate logic they had used for other commodities. Enforcement hardened in response. The United States introduced regulatory controls aimed not only at illicit manufacture but at the ingredients that made that manufacture possible. The Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005 is a neat pivot point in this story. Congress moved to restrict over-the-counter access to pseudoephedrine and ephedrine, common precursors, by restricting sales, mandating behind-the-counter placement, limiting quantities per purchaser, and requiring identification and transaction logs. Within months and years, the visible domestic production of meth in the United States, the small labs in rural trailers and motel rooms, diminished. But markets adapt. When local supply constraints bite, entrepreneurs, legitimate, illegitimate, and usually a blend of both, seek alternative channels. For meth, this meant a pivot toward international supply chains and industrialized production in geography where enforcement or corruption were less prohibitive. Mexico's cartels seized that opening. Their superlabs could exploit cheaper labor, local complicity, and the economies of scale that made production cost-effective, even after factoring in smuggling losses. The result was an inversion, a drug that had long been infused into American life in small doses through medical and social normalization, now flowed into the country in industrial quantities, entering urban night economies and rural towns alike. The violence that accompanied cartel control, territorial fights fought with rifles and improvised explosives, assassinations of public officials, kidnappings, became part of the drug's socio-economic footprint. President Felipe Calderón's escalation of federal forces against the cartels in 2006 marked a violent intensification of an already lethal economy. The battle for control of licit and illicit trade routes multiplied the stakes for everyone involved. Across the Pacific, Thailand in 2003 under Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra implemented a brutal and widely criticised war on drugs campaign that targeted methamphetamine use and distribution with extraordinary force. Thousands were killed in a matter of months, a grim reminder that states sometimes attempt to defeat drug markets with ferocity rather than with public health. Meanwhile, production hubs also flourished in places the global media had not always expected. The Golden Triangle, the lawless borderlands of Myanmar, Laos and Thailand, long notorious for opium, retooled parts of its production infrastructure towards synthetic stimulants. Ethnic armed groups, most notably the United Gue State Army in Myanmar's Shan State, became implicated in mass production of methamphetamine tablets destined for Southeast Asian markets. The tablets, known as yaba, were stamped with logos and colours and exported in enormous quantities across borders into Thailand, Cambodia and beyond. They were cheap, engineered for portability and mass consumption, and they made whole economies, from small traders to corrupt officials, complicit in their passage. In Europe, the dissolution of Soviet-era controls and the expansion of chemical industry capacity in Eastern Europe and China underwrote new flows of precursors and new clandestine laboratories in places like the Czech Republic and Poland. In each case, the dynamic was recognisably capitalist. Where demand exists, supply will be found, and where controls tighten in one place, suppliers will shift operations to another. Those shifts were not purely geographic, they were also chemical and logistical. The more effectively governments regulated specific precursor chemicals like pseudoephedrine and ephedrine, the more traffickers looked for alternative synthetic routes and alternative sources. Phenyl-2-propanone P2P and other precursors began to be used as substitutes where ephedrine-based methods were constrained. The choice of chemical pathway shapes the scale and the profile of production. Some routes require more sophisticated equipment but yield larger batches and higher purity. Others fit the one-pot improvisations of a motel room operator better. I will not describe processes here, but it is important to note that chemical substitution opened a strategic game of adaptation. China's sprawling chemical industry and later Indian firms were sometimes either sources of precursors or unwitting suppliers via brokers who did not ask too many questions. Faced with the international pressure of the 1988 UN Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances, the treaty that for the first time targeted the chemicals themselves and not only finished drugs, nations started to register precursors, introduce pre-export notification systems, and crack down on suspicious consignments. The result was a regulatory cat-and-mouse match that has endured into the 21st century. Rule followed by adaptation, enforcement followed by innovation. Forms of methamphetamine matured in parallel with these supply chain innovations. The drug is many things to many people, depending upon its physical form and the local vernacular that enfolds it. In the United States in the late 20th century, speed connoted the powdered form sold for insufflation or for ingestion. Crystal or ice suggested the fully formed glass-like shards that were meant to be smoked and that carried a cultural imprint of the West Coast and the Pacific Rim. In Southeast Asia, tablets stamped with colourful logos, the ubiquitous Yaba, dominated markets, engineered for concealment and rapid distribution. In Japan and Korea, the post-war fill-upon culture had once favoured tablets. In the Philippines, a term like shabu entered everyday speech to denote meth in various guises. Each form has its own rituals. Tablets can be casual, slipped into pockets at parties and swallowed without paraphernalia. Powder invites social sharing, snorting at desks and dance halls. Crystalline meth encourages smoking, a consumption practice that produces a tight, intense high and a social pattern of repeated sessions that has obvious implications for dependence and harm. The forms also shape harms and public health responses. Smoking crystal meth leads to quick onset and repeated dosing, and thereby to a pattern of binging that correlates with certain social harms. Increased risky behaviours, dental damage, and acute psychiatric presentations. Tablets produce less intense immediate peaks but longer overall exposure. They are often more socially diffused, reaching broader swathes of communities at lower price points. Injection carries the additional layer of blood-borne disease risk, especially hepatitis and HIV. But the prevalence of injection varies by region and over time, as social norms and public health infrastructures change. Public health responses must therefore be as multifaceted as consumption itself, harm reduction, needle exchange, drug treatment programs tailored to stimulant dependence, and social interventions that address the economic precarity feeding the production side. In places where punitive enforcement dominated, treatment and prevention often became secondary. Where harm reduction found political purchase, outcomes, while never ideal, were measurably better in terms of disease transmission and social reintegration. Politics of precursors, meanwhile, became an arena of international negotiation and domestic contestation. Retail pharmacy sales restrictions in the United States diminished local, small-scale manufacture, but created a lucrative export market for high-purity meth from Mexico and elsewhere. European Union-wide measures on precursor tracking, bilateral agreements between nations, and the engagement of the International Narcotics Control Board all attempted to choke off routes of supply. China, confronted with growing evidence that chemical companies were diverting shipments, moved in the 2000s and 2010s to regulate exports and to shutter facilities implicated in diversion. India undertook its own regulatory tightening after international pressure, when evidence accrued that its generics and chemical firms were being used as nodal points in precursor distribution chains. The international system is not a perfect net. It is, however, a network of levers, declarations, inspections, criminal penalties, and cooperation agreements that make some paths harder, and in doing so reshape the choices of illicit networks. Each tightening provokes a countermove, a rerouting of shipping, a relocation of chemical synthesis, a shift in the choice of precursors, and each countermove defines the next set of policy priorities. Market innovations reflected both the physical constraints and the entrepreneurial creativity of traffickers. Packaging changed to evade detection, pills were hidden in foodstuffs, powders resealed as harmless industrial chemicals, crystals disguised as salts, shipping windows shifted to nocturnal schedules, couriers travelled with false backstories that fit border scrutiny. The internet introduced a new vector. By the early 2010s, darknet marketplaces such as Silk Road had demonstrated that stimulants, among many other substances, could be bought and sold with less direct physical contact, paid for in cryptocurrencies and mailed in innocuous parcels. This did not render the old routes obsolete, but it added an extra layer of distribution. Consumers in one city could order directly from a producer on another continent, and the delivery system of modern logistics made such transfers both possible and surprisingly resistant to detection. The economies built around meth are not merely criminal abstractions. They touch the weathered tables and small-town diner counting rooms, the semi-detached houses where carpet is forever stained, the shipping docks where containers pass like in different cities, and the borderland communities where a trucker's route has always been coextensive with the art of moving things through gaps. They are also political constituencies in miniature, manufacturers who once operated with pharmaceutical licenses, pharmacists who lose their licenses when diversion is discovered, small dealers who become for a time small-time bosses, state responses, from rehabilitation programs to militarized interdictions, have reshaped these economies, sometimes displacing them but rarely eradicating them. Demand persists, economies reorganize. Everything about meth's modern trajectory is therefore a study in adaptation. Surplus becomes normalization. Normalization begets concern. Concern yields regulation. Regulation narrows legitimate supply and enlarges illicit profit margins. Illicit producers scale and globalize. Enforcement responds with new law and diplomacy. Traffickers find new chemicals, new labs, new shipping routes, and new markets. In the end, one might say the drug's character was always twofold: a productive chemical for medical uses and a highly effective reagent for social compulsions to help productivity for a time and then help to hollow it out. That ironical duality of a chemical both useful and ruinous is what makes the history not merely moral but material. Sometime in the haze of policy and profiteering, the world's relationship to meth reached a peculiar equilibrium. Powerful, organized criminals industrialized production and became, in some regions, the primary suppliers. States wielded both soft and hard power to counter and sometimes co-opt the infrastructures that made supply possible. The form of the drug diversified to meet specific consumption cultures. Public health systems contended with epidemics shaped by the chemistry of delivery as much as by the chemistry of the molecule itself. The story is not yet finished. Precursor laws tighten here and loosen there. Darknet marketplaces vanish and reappear. Chemical companies change ownership and names. Each change creates a new marginal advantage for one actor or another. But across decades and continents, the pattern remains stubbornly similar. Regulation on the one hand and market innovation on the other. A patient dance of restriction and circumvention, each informing the next step. If the drug began in factories of war as a performance enhancer for soldiers and factory workers, its modern life is an unfolding document of how modern societies try, haltingly, sometimes brutally, to organize desire and supply. The super soldier dream faded into a darker, more dispersed reality. Millions of ordinary people became consumers in varied fashions. Whole towns and some states measured their fortunes and misfortunes against the flows of stimulant income. Cartels and insurgent groups reinvented themselves as chemists and logisticians. There is a certain black comedy in it. An invention that once promised to keep nations awake wound up compelling them to stay awake and watch their own institutions scramble to keep up. On quiet nights, one can trace the market pathways like veins on a map. The Golden Triangle's long-distance trade in tablets, weaving through Southeast Asian railheads, Baja California, and Sinaloa's industrial output streaming northwards into American cities. The Czech and Polish clandestine labs serving regional markets and intermittently exporting to Western Europe. The chemical brokers in East Asia shifting paperwork and consolidating shipments when faces in Washington or Geneva begin to turn their attention. It is all logistical choreography, supply chains pursued and interrupted, capital seeking returns in whatever shape the law allows or the law unwittingly provides. The human cost of those chains has been immense, but the policy lesson may be quieter and more structural. You cannot simply close a door without understanding the building that door sits on. Close the kitchen and the pressure will drive the steam through the walls. So the post-war history of methamphetamine is not merely a catalogue of harms, nor only a tale of criminal ingenuity. It is an archive of how modern states and markets co-create problems by trying to solve them. It is also, and importantly, a story of how form matters, how the difference between a pill and a shard produces different social scripts and public health responses, and of how international politics of chemicals shape street markets and life outcomes. The treaty signatures, the radar charts of seizures, the quiet ledger of pharmacy logs, the anonymous posts on an online market, and taken together, form a map of modernity's attempt to govern pleasure and productivity. In that map, one sees recurring motifs: regulation entwined with ingenuity, prohibition followed by adaptation, local economies folded into transnational systems. If the drug was once touted to make soldiers into superhuman instruments of endurance, its modern legacy is more prosaic and more tragic. An engine that helped some people eke out livelihoods, destabilized others, and bound governments, companies, and criminal organizations into an uneasy, ongoing contest over chemistry and control. When methamphetamine reaches the brain, it behaves like an uninvited messenger who not only announces himself but pushes open the doors and drags the lights into the street. The first minutes are bright and clean. Energy surges, fatigue peels away, speech quickens, heat and hunger recede. Those sensations map cleanly onto a biochemical drama that neuroscientists have been sketching in increasing detail since the late 20th century. Meth is a potent releaser of the brain's catecholamines, most notably dopamine and norepinephrine, and it does so by commandeering the very machinery neurons use to shuttle those chemicals around. In plain language, the drug floods reward circuits, then rewires them, with consequences that begin as pleasurable and soon harden into compulsion. In the mesolimbic system, the ancient circuitry that links the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex, dopamine is the currency of salience and reinforcement. Early experiments with animals and later positron emission tomography studies in humans showed that amphetamines cause a dramatic spike of dopamine in this pathway. The young neurologist Nora Volkov, working in the 1990s and 2000s, made this visible with PET scans that correlated surges of synaptic dopamine with intense subjective euphoria and with the loss of control that defines addiction. Meth does several things at once. It sneaks into presynaptic neurons through transporters that normally remove dopamine from the synapse. It forces dopamine out of storage vesicles by disrupting the vesicular monoamine transporter, and it reverses the flow across plasma membrane transporters so that neurons pump dopamine out into the synapse instead of reabsorbing it. The result is not a gentle increase, but a torrent. Norepinephrine rises alongside dopamine, giving the body speed and the mind alertness, useful in a war and ruinous in long-term living rooms. That immediate biochemical abundance explains why meth felt like a godsend to soldiers in the 1930s and 40s. In Germany, Temmler's Pervitin pills kept infantry moving in the winter of 1939. In Imperial Japan, Philippine found use among pilots and factory workers. The molecule's old celebrity on battlefields is also a cautionary note. Its capacity to override sleep and fear made it useful strategically and devastating personally. But the brain remembers. Repeat the torrent and the system adapts. receptors are downregulated, dopamine transporter availability falls, neurons change their firing patterns. Circuits that once regulated impulse, judgment and reward begin to favour habit over reason. Those changes are neither instantaneous nor entirely visible, but they are persistent. Over weeks and months of heavy use, users can find the world flattened. Nothing tastes as good as the drug. Interest fades, motivation collapses, and the drug, criminally efficient, becomes the axis around which life revolves. The chronic neural adaptations are complex but can be sketched in humane terms. Repeated bursts of dopamine blunt the sensitivity of postsynaptic receptors. The brain's volume knob for pleasure turns down. The frontal lobes, which sit on top of the reward system and normally temper urges with plans and consequences, become functionally weaker. The habit-forming dorsal striatum grabs more control. Cue-induced craving, a smell, a familiar room, a face, triggers the aged reflex of addiction. Meanwhile, the biochemistry that once replenished neurotransmitters frays. Mitochondria are stressed. Oxidative metabolites accumulate and inflammatory microglia begin to nibble at neuronal terminals. Animal research through the 1980s and 1990s and human imaging from the 1990s onward painted the same worrying picture. Meth can be neurotoxic to dopaminergic and serotonergic axons, and the damage seems to correlate with the intensity and duration of exposure. Those physiological shifts show up as real-world harms. Cognitively, chronic meth users often suffer deficits in attention, working memory, and executive function. Planning collapses into urgency, learning slows, and decisions skew toward immediate rewards. Clinicians have recognized for decades a stimulant-induced psychosis that mirrors paranoid schizophrenia, persecutory delusions, visual and auditory hallucinations, tactile hallucinations of insects under the skin that produce the infamous phenomenon known as formication. The psychosis can be transient, resolving weeks after abstinence, and yet for some it becomes a recurring or persistent disorder that requires long-term psychiatric care. Sleep deprivation, a hallmark of prolonged binges, compounds the problem, producing a kind of sleep-starved delirium that, when layered on top of stimulant neurotoxicity, can produce profound deterioration. The body outside the skull pays too. Cardiovascular strain is immediate. Tachycardia, elevated blood pressure, vasoconstriction. Acute use can precipitate arrhythmias, myocardial infarction and stroke. Chronic use can produce a dilated cardiomyopathy, a weakening of the heart muscle that, in case series reported across the United States and Australia since the early 2000s, has been linked to meth exposure. The mechanism mixes sympathetic overdrive with direct toxicity. Hypothermia during binges, often worsened by crowded, overheated environments and dehydration, accelerates muscle breakdown, rhabdomyolysis, which can then damage kidneys. Lungs, when people smoke crystal meth, can be scarred. When they inject, veins and soft tissue infections proliferate. Wound care, antibiotics and surgeries for abscesses become recurring costs in hospitals and clinics in regions with heavy meth prevalence. There are also the slow, visible erosions that feed headlines. Meth mouth, a pattern of severe dental decay and gum disease resulting from dry mouth, clenching, poor hygiene and nutritional neglect. Severe weight loss, skin lesions from picking, chronic infections. But even these external signs are the aftermath of a deeper interior collapse. The immune system seems to tilt under chronic use. Susceptibility to infections rises. Sexual behaviour changes under meth's influence as well. In settings where meth is used to facilitate prolonged sexual encounters, a phenomenon documented in gay urban scenes in cities like San Francisco, London and Sydney since the late 20th century, rates of HIV and other sexually transmitted infections can rise, intertwining the epidemic of a stimulant with the age-old epidemiology of viruses. Pregnancy is a particularly acute fault line. Women who use meth while pregnant face higher rates of placental problems, preterm labour and low birth weight babies. Neonatal exposure can produce immediate complications that require intensive care. Longer-term developmental studies are messy because socioeconomic factors, polysubstance use and prenatal nutrition all intertwine. Yet a persistent signal emerges in cohort studies from the United States, Australia and Europe. Some children prenatally exposed to meth show elevated risks for attention deficits, behavioural problems and learning difficulties as they grow. In the 1950s, Japan that woke from a wartime meth wave, whole communities learnt the hard lesson that legal and medical access to stimulants in one generation can leave social and developmental shadows on the next. Recovery is possible. The brain is plastic and can regain function over months and years. Nora Volkov's longitudinal PET studies in the early 2000s offered a guarded hope. Some measures of dopamine transporter availability and prefrontal metabolic activity improved after sustained abstinence. Cognitive remediation, stable housing, nutrition, and therapy all help. But the path back is long, and in many places funding and services are either scarce or oriented toward punitive outcomes rather than sustained support. For many individuals, the physiological adaptations, the weakened brakes in the prefrontal cortex, the shrunken reward responses, make staying away a huge daily act of will that requires systems of care rather than solitary resolve. If the brain and body tell one part of the story, the human toll tells another. And it is here the histories of families and communities become painfully visible. Across continents, methamphetamine epidemics have a common script. They arrive quickly in certain social niches, they entrench where services are thin, and they spread along the logistical arteries of labour, migration and trade. In rural American counties in the 90s and early 2000s, for example, clandestine mum-and-pop labs proliferated on quiet roads and in trailers, exploiting easy access to pseudoephedrine and over-the-counter cold medicines, and the isolation that concealed fumes and explosions. Those small labs left chemical residues that rendered homes uninhabitable, and imposed clean-up costs that city budgets and personal savings could not easily bear. Child Protective Services began to see meth as the common factor in a rising share of neglect and abuse cases. In Missouri, Oklahoma, and parts of the upper Midwest, county courts and social services scrambled to meet a surge in family breakups and foster care numbers in the first decade of the 21st century. Urban traces look different, but are no less devastating. Cities that saw the industrial decline and concentrated unemployment, places where housing stock is insecure and social capital frayed, provided fertile ground for meth spread. In the Tenderloin of San Francisco or the working-class neighbourhoods of Melbourne, families fractured under the twin pressures of addiction and poverty. Children who might once have been shielded by extended kin networks found themselves in foster care, shuttled between homes. Parental incarceration for possession or related acquisitive crimes became a recurrent theme. Family structures collapsed not merely from drug use, but from the criminal justice responses that removed breadwinners and caregivers. Certain populations have been hit disproportionately. Indigenous communities in North America and Australia, already contending with the intergenerational legacies of dispossession and poverty, found meth to be both an accelerant and a mirror of structural inequalities. In remote parts of Canada's western provinces and the Northern Territories, and in the Northern Territory and Western Australia, community leaders spoke in the 2000s and 2010s of a crisis that arrived on flights and trucks along supply routes, finding in small towns a victimless market that it was not. The social fabric and sporting clubs, schools, local governance, frayed as nights were lost to bingers, as paychecks evaporated, as trust was replaced by suspicion. Governments moved with varying speed to respond. Some invested in culturally attuned treatment and housing, others mainly pursued policing. The results were uneven. In Southeast Asia, meth's imprint was also heavy, but shaped by different histories. The crystalline pill forms known as yaba swept through Thailand and the Mekong region by the 1990s and 2000s. The social impact was widespread, from Bangkok's nightlife to the villages of Myanmar's borderlands. Governments oscillated between harsh enforcement and harm-minimizing strategies. In the Philippines, When Rodrigo Duterte assumed the presidency in 2016 and declared a nationwide war on drugs centered against Shabu, the state's response was immediate and brutal. With thousands of extrajudicial killings and deep international concern, the stated intention was to purge communities of the drug's harms. The result, as many human rights observers argued, was trauma, fear, and a further erosion of public trust in the institutions meant to protect citizens. That is the cruel arithmetic of punitive policy. It sometimes reduces visible open markets but multiplies invisible harms. The LGBTQ+ communities in global cities offer yet another lens. Beginning in the late 20th century and spreading into the 2000s, meth use in certain circuits of gay men, part of chemsex cultures in London, Sydney and New York, linked stimulants to sexual networks in ways that altered epidemiology. Longer sessions, multiple partners and reduced inhibitions raised HIV transmission risks. Public health responses had to navigate stigma, criminalization, and the realities of pleasure and intimacy. Clinics that offered combined sexual health and addiction services, harm reduction through condoms, clean needles, and non-judgmental counseling made a measurable difference where they were available, but such integrated approaches were not uniformly available. These intimate devastations scale up to public systems. Emergency departments report spikes in stimulant-related presentations, psychosis, cardiovascular emergencies, severe crying mothers whose babies have been removed, needle-borne infections. Mental health services are overloaded with chronic psychoses and mood disorders. Child welfare agencies, as I said, see caseloads balloon. Homeless shelters fill with people who have been pushed out of employment. Employers find absenteeism and unsafe performance rising in sectors like trucking and mining. Economists can tally some of the costs: healthcare, law enforcement, lost productivity, but the numbers never fully capture the quiet, accumulative sorrow of neighbourhoods emptied of older social anchors. Public policy has sometimes been the solvent and sometimes the salt. In a key move, legislative action in the United States reshaped the course of the epidemic. The Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005 restricted over-the-counter access to pseudoephedrine, the common cold pill precursor that fueled domestic lab production in the 1990s and early 2000s. The law worked in one sense. It dramatically reduced the proliferation of small, toxic household labs that exploded in trailer parks and buried their chemicals in backyard barrels. But the market adjusted. The vacuum that US policy created invited enterprises with deeper pockets and fewer scruples to scale up production elsewhere. Mexican cartels, already deeply involved in heroin and cocaine, moved aggressively into large-scale meth production, building super labs and establishing transnational precursor supply chains. Where one problem receded from front yards, a different set of harms arrived on a larger and often more violent scale. That judicial and logistical pivot is the central irony of enforcement. Supply-side pressures rarely eliminate demand. They shift geography, actors, and criminal strategies. After 2005, the small domestic manufacturer largely disappeared from American headlines, replaced by cartel-run smuggling that crossed borders by sea, land and air. The Sinaloa cartel, long a diversified enterprise based in the deserts and coastal regions of Sinaloa and Culiacan, expanded its share of the meth market in the late 2000s, producing high-purity crystalline meth and shipping it north. Other groups, Los Zetas in their brutal heyday, and later the Jalisco New Generation cartel, entered the fray, and what was once petty clandestine chemistry became an industrial-scale business with supply chains reaching into Asia for precursors and corrupt pockets of local governance for protection. Asia too witnessed shifts. The Golden Triangle, Myanmar, Laos and Thailand changed shape as insurgent armies and criminal syndicates industrialized the production of pills and crystalline meth. Precursors flowed from chemical suppliers in East Asia into clandestine labs controlled by both private armies and criminal entrepreneurs. By the 2010s, Myanmar's Shan state had become a particularly prominent node for mass production, where armed groups and traffickers negotiated fragile truces and violent clashes in pursuit of profit. the UNODC repeatedly documented the rise of meth production in Southeast Asia, noting that the pills and crystals were no longer a marginal commodity but a mass-market product. Every enforcement action rippled in the market. Crackdowns on precursors in China during the 2010s changed the calculus for chemists, pushing them toward alternative synthetic routes or different supply chains. When one choke point closed, another opened. Criminal enterprises are, after all, logisticians. They adapt. They also bring violence as a tool of governance. Territorial control, extortion, and brutality are ways to secure production and distribution networks. That is the clearest link between meth markets and high-level organised crime. The larger the enterprise, the greater the capital at stake, and the more willing actors become to use violence and corruption to secure that capital. At street level, meth fuels acquisitive crimes, theft, burglary, and robbery, as dependent users seek means to feed a habit that is expensive and erratically supplied. But meth-related criminality is not only about desperate users, it is also about organised violence, cartel shootouts, kidnappings, protection rackets. The social landscapes of cities and border regions change. Public spaces become dangerous. Local businesses pay levies to avoid violence. Municipal budgets redistribute from community services to night patrols and cleanups. The environmental toll is real too. Clandestine labs contaminate soil and water with solvents and byproducts. Cleanup is costly and rarely complete. Faced with such complexity, societies have chosen different mixes of response. Some double down on criminalisation, preferring raids, mandatory minimums, and military-style interventions. Others lean toward harm reduction, treatment, and decriminalisation. The Portuguese model, implemented in 2001, is instructive even if not a perfect analogue. By decriminalising all drugs for personal use and investing heavily in treatment and social reintegration, Portugal shifted many users from the criminal justice system into public healthcare, with measurable declines in HIV transmission and drug-related deaths over a decade. It did not make drugs harmless. It reallocated societal effort toward health outcomes. The contrast with punitive campaigns, whether the militarized operations in parts of Mexico after 2006 under President Felipe Calderón, or the extrajudicial violence of the Philippines under President Duterte after 2016, is stark. In the latter, short-term displays of control produced humanitarian crises, and in many respects did little to address the chronic needs of people struggling with addiction. Treatment itself remains a stubborn frontier. Unlike opioid addiction, for which methadone and buprenorphine provide clear pharmacological pathways to stabilization, meth addiction has no widely accepted pharmacotherapy with regulatory approval. Behavioral interventions, cognitive behavioral therapy, contingency management, have evidence, especially contingency management for its pragmatic rewards-based structure, but these require sustained funding and political will. Rural and marginalised communities, the very places where meth often gains traction, frequently lack the infrastructure for these programs. Harm reduction measures, needle and syringe exchanges, sexual health services, safer consumption advice, blunt secondary harms but are politically toxic in many jurisdictions. There is also the problem of measurement and attention. When headlines chase meth's most dramatic violences, they sometimes miss the slow erosion of opportunity that the drug produces, a generation of workers cycling through jail and treatment and precarious labour markets, children whose schooling is interrupted, whole neighbourhoods where civic participation dwindles. Those quieter damages are harder to legislate against because they are diffuse and chronic. The political system prefers crises it can declare won or lost. Yet history tells us that epidemics are shifted, not ended, by policy choices. When the United States closed small lab supply avenues in 2005, it did not abolish demand. When Mexico chose militarization in 2006, it did not cut off consumer markets to the north. When parts of Southeast Asia tightened border controls, production often migrated to new territories. The meth market is a hydra of supply chains and social needs. Cut one head and two more will sprout unless you simultaneously treat the wound that makes people consume. So we return to an old patient counsel. The problem is both biochemical and social. Meth changes brains and bodies. It fractures families and communities, and it creates markets where violence and corruption can flourish. The historical record, from Pervitin and Philippon in the 1930s and 1940s, through rural American labs of the 1990s, to cartel superlabs in Sinaloa after 2005, and the Yaba factories of Shan State, shows a pattern of substitution and adaptation. Policymakers who ignore either the neurobiological compel or the social landscape do so at their peril. Compassionate treatment, sensible regulation of precursors, harm reduction, and measures that rebuild economic and social life in vulnerable places are not soft options. They are strategies that, unlike the old slogans of war and prohibition, account for human biology and human society together. The story of meth is a long, bent tale, but it is not an inexorable one. Brains can heal, communities can be rebuilt, and history, if we listen carefully in the quiet, insists that policy is not destiny, it is choice. When governments first confronted the peculiar problem of methamphetamine, a molecule that had been promised as performance and then proved to be trouble, they did what governments often do. They organised themselves into committees, appointed czars, and chose metaphors. The metaphors mattered. In Washington in 1971, the Nixon White House declared drug abuse public enemy number one, and the language of war furnished policy frameworks. Supply lines to be cut, invaders to be repelled, enemies to be arrested. The administration of programs followed the metaphors. The Drug Enforcement Administration, created in 1973, grew like a constabulary for chemical interdiction. In 1988, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act created the Office of National Drug Control Policy, a new bureaucracy whose daily bread was the rhetoric of interdiction. Across the Pacific in Tokyo, the experience tasted different, but ended up with a similar appetite for control. Post-war revelations that methamphetamine, once distributed to soldiers and marketed as a stimulant, had leaked into a civilian market, produced a fear that was translated into law and policing, into a cultural shaming that persists. In Southeast Asia, the image was of an economy of pills moving through jungle borders. In Mexico and Australia, it was men and women in garages and ranches producing crystalline forms for captive markets. The policy choices that followed were never purely technical. They were political declarations about what the state thought of suffering, sin, and safety. From that first impulse to punish, two very different currents of response have been visible for half a century. The heavy interdiction-focused model that put boots on streets and agents at ports, and the quieter, more careful public health model that looked to prevention, harm reduction, and treatment. The punitive model has clear, simple logic. Reduce supply, increase the cost and risk of dealing, deter consumers with the threat of jail. It likes clear enemies, clear metrics, arrests made, kilograms seized, and headlines. The Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act, signed in the United States in 2005, exemplifies this logic in legislative clothing. It tightened control over precursors, pseudoephedrine, phenylpropanolamine, pushing cold medicines behind pharmacy counters, instituting purchase limits and tracking, and legislating sharp penalties. It worked in its narrow sense. Within a few years, the number of small one-pot domestic labs in the United States declined dramatically. Media stories about parents making meth in kitchen sinks became less common. The law achieved what laws often do. It changed supply mechanics. But supply-side wins hide messy trade-offs. Interdiction does not remove demand, and the marketplace, given human incentives, reorganizes. What was once a row of small operations in basements and trailers rearranged itself into international production, often under the auspices of transnational criminal groups. After the 2005 restrictions in the United States, chemical flows shifted south and east. Precursors were rerouted, and Mexican cartels scaled up the manufacture of higher purity crystalline methamphetamine for the American market, using different chemical routes and larger laboratories. Within the span of a decade, the site of a backyard lab in a Midwestern town had been replaced by long-distance trafficking networks and sophisticated clandestine industrial operations. Law enforcement victories felt immediate. The epidemiological curve of use did not bend so permanently. And where interdiction focuses, other harms multiply. Violence around production and transit nodes, corruption of local officials, incarceration that fractures families and reduces economic options for communities that most need investment. The public health alternative, in contrast, starts with a set of quieter, less cinematic observations. People who use drugs are not merely criminals, they are patients, neighbours, sometimes protected citizens whose behaviours are driven by a web of social, economic and psychiatric forces. Prevention investments on school programs, economic alternatives, family supports are long-term and unglamorous. Harm reduction, clean needles, supervised consumption rooms, drug checking, distribution of safer smoking kits can seem to some politicians and parts of the public like conceding defeat. But the evidence base that has accumulated since the HIV crisis of the 80s is hard to dismiss. Clean syringe programs dramatically reduce the transmission of blood-borne infections. Supervised consumption rooms like Insight in Vancouver, which opened in 2003 amid a finely detailed legal and political struggle and survived a landmark Supreme Court decision in Canada in 2011, reduced public injecting, increased uptake of detox and treatment services, and were not associated with increases in crime. Portugal's experiment starting in 2001, decriminalisation of possession for personal use paired with expanded treatment and social support, offers a long-term example of shifting vast sums of social energy from prosecution toward care and produced declines in problematic use, drug-related deaths, and new HIV infections over time. These are not poetic victories. They are measurable and they are quiet. The comparison is not binary. The most successful systems have been deployed as hybrids that accept a role for law enforcement in disrupting violent traffickers and major production, while insisting that the people on the receiving end of street markets be treated primarily through public health mechanisms. Australia's harm minimisation approach, adopted in policy language in the mid-80s and returned to with urgency during the ICE crisis of the 2010s, coupled pleating with needle exchanges, medically supervised injecting centres in some jurisdictions, and a steady growth of treatment capacity, even as federal and state governments scrambled over whether to tighten precursor controls or to fund more services. The United States has found this hybrid awkward. Federal statutes and local politics have produced a spaghetti of responses, regions that relied heavily on law enforcement, cities that invested in syringe exchange and overdose prevention, and countless lives caught in the seams. Punitive policies reduce certain visible harms in the short run, but, if unaccompanied by prevention and care, can recur as displacement and violence. Public health policies reduce harm at the individual and community levels, but need political will and money. Without them, supply-side reductions can be cruel, producing temporary scarcity without addressing root causes. When we look at the interventions in practice, the diversity is striking. Drug courts, which began in the United States with a prototype in Miami-Dade County in 1989, were born of the same hybrid impulse. Use the coercive power of the court to compel treatment rather than punishment. Participants are diverted from traditional prosecution into supervised regimens of therapy, urine testing and monitored abstinence. Success is pronounced in some programs and limited in others. Meta-analyses show reductions in recidivism in many drug court models, but the effect sizes are modest and heavily conditioned on program fidelity. The degree to which magistrates and clinicians maintain therapeutic rigour rather than treating the court as a shortcut to punishment. The court is a blunt instrument. If it is used to funnel people into evidence-based treatment with sufficient resources, it can reduce crime and improve outcomes. If it is used to tidy up caseloads with token therapy, it becomes another conveyor belt to incarceration. Harm reduction programs read like a set of opposites to the courtroom's gavel. None of them are glamorous, all of them are practical. Syringe exchanges distributed since the 1980s are a first line against infection. Safer smoking kits, provided in varying degrees in Australia, Canada, and parts of Europe, reduce burns and respiratory injuries from improvised pipes. Drug checking services, from simple colorimetric tests to TR spectroscopy on the street, have proven life-saving where fentanyl contaminates stimulant supplies, a particularly cruel twist of the opioid epidemic in North America, where methamphetamine suddenly carried a lethal adulterant. Supervised consumption sites accept the reality of continued use and provide a controlled environment in which overdoses can be reversed and people can be connected to health services. They offend conservative sensibilities. They save lives. Public health literature is filled with polite, heavily footnoted ways of saying that the latter is more important. The politics of implementation matter, with a severity that clinical trials seldom account for. Contingency management, the modestly radical idea of giving people small, reliable rewards for clean urine samples, reliably reduces methamphetamine use, according to randomized trials from the United States to Australia. Yet it offends a moral intuition in some places. Paying people to be sober seems, to opponents, like bribery, and some funding sources explicitly prohibit it. Similarly, syringe exchanges were hampered for decades by federal prohibitions and local legal barriers in many American cities until pragmatic public health professionals, alarmed by HIV and hepatitis C outbreaks, pushed back. Drug policy is not simply a matter of evidence, it is a matter of rhetoric, of who gets to define virtue, and of how budgets flow. When budgets reward arrest statistics rather than treatment retention, institutions tilt toward enforcement. Those institutional orientations have practical consequences for treatment and recovery. For methamphetamine use disorder, the hard clinical truth is that as of 2024, there is no singularly effective, widely approved pharmacotherapy. Unlike opioid use disorder, where methadone and buprenorphine have changed the calculus of treatment and mortality, stimulants do not yet have an equivalent rescue medication. The clinical research landscape is messy but not empty. Psychosocial interventions, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, motivational interviewing, the matrix model remain the backbone of care. The matrix model, developed in California, in response to the proliferation of stimulant misuse, packages structured group therapy, individual counseling, family education, and random drug testing into an outpatient program designed for retention and relapse prevention. It is not an elegant silver bullet, it is a scaffolding under which a recovery sometimes happens. Contingency management is the single psychosocial innovation with the most consistent randomized controlled trial support for stimulants, including methamphetamine. In trials where participants received vouchers or small cash rewards for biologically verified abstinence, rates of continuous abstinence and clinical attendance rose. The effect is nearly as robust as one could hope for in the behavioral sciences, simple, replicable and scalable. Yet the policy tempering of human incentive, rightly framed as civic prudence by some and as anachronistic moralism by others, has constrained uptake. It is almost comical. Evidence that behaviours can be shifted with a little money has collided with a belief that moral suasion should be sufficient. The reality is prosaic. Time-limited financial rewards are not an affront to civilization. They are a pragmatic lever. On the pharmacological front, a handful of recent clinical trials have produced encouraging but cautious signals. Combination strategies, notably trials pairing bupropion, an antidepressant and mild stimulant, with naltrexone, an opioid antagonist that modulates reward pathways, have shown promise in particular subgroups, such as those with certain patterns of use or demographic profiles. Trials of mirtazapine have shown benefit in specific populations, such as men who have sex with men, particularly when meth use is tied to sexual behaviour. Agonist strategies, prescribing controlled stimulants as a form of substitution therapy, modelled conceptually after methadone for opioids, have been studied, with low-dose dexamphetamine or methylphenidate trials suggesting potential utility in reducing illicit stimulant use. None of these approaches has yet delivered a universally approved population-level treatment, which is to say that the pharmacological piece of the puzzle is in flight, It is promising in narrow windows and disappointingly absent as a universal panacea. That absence makes integrated, community-based care all the more essential. Methamphetamine use often travels with psychiatric comorbidity, depressive disorders, anxiety, trauma histories, and stimulant-induced psychosis, and with infectious diseases transmitted through risky behaviour. The most effective treatment models, therefore, do not treat meth use in isolation. They stitch together primary care, mental health services, infectious disease management, particularly hepatitis C treatment in the last decade, which is curative and should be part of any modern program, housing and employment supports, and peer recovery services. Assertive community treatment teams that bring multidisciplinary care into the community. Housing-first programs that provide stable shelter without abstinence preconditions, and recovery community organisations that offer peer coaching and social capital all multiply the effect of therapy sessions. The science on the social determinants of recovery is increasingly precise. Stable housing, meaningful work, and social belonging are as potent as any specific manual-based therapy. Peer-led supports deserve particular attention because they carry a quality that bureaucratic programs often lack: trust. Recovery coaches, individuals with lived experience who are trained to provide outreach and support, are now integrated into many emergency departments, treatment centres, and re-entry programs. Oxford Houses, the US model of democratically managed sober living homes that emerged in the 1970s and proliferated thereafter, offer another community model: sober peers living and working together with minimal clinician oversight. Evidence suggests that peer support increases engagement, reduces relapse risk, and enhances retention in treatment. It is also cost-effective. Yet peer-led work is undervalued and underfunded in many countries where the default policy is top-down control. Access is an operational problem. A clinic can have excellent therapies on the books, but no staff who know how to deliver contingency management, no interpreters for multilingual communities, or no transportation funds to get clients in the door. In the United States, patchwork insurance coverage and the dynamics of states that did or did not expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act means that some regions were already struggling to pay for high-quality behavioral therapies when the meth wave grew. Rural areas, where outbreaks of stimulant use have often been intense, suffer from clinician shortages. Telehealth has helped, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, when regulatory flexibilities increased remote counselling and medication management. Yet telehealth cannot substitute for local housing and employment supports. The global topography of methamphetamine's harms is instructive because it insists that history, economy, and policy environments shape epidemics as much as the pharmacology of the drug itself. Consider Japan, which has a particularly instructive tale. The molecule's Japanese history began in laboratories in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when chemists like Nagai Nagayoshi first synthesized related compounds. During World War II, stimulant pills were distributable to augment soldier performance. In the dislocations of the post-war years, surplus supplies and a fragmented regulatory environment allowed methamphetamine's use to seed civilian markets. The moral panic that followed produced a distinctive national response: stringent legal controls, aggressive policing, and a cultural mechanism of shame that makes public acknowledgement of drug use socially ruinous. The result is paradoxical. On one hand, measured population surveys reveal that the prevalence of illicit drug use in Japan is low, compared to many Western countries. On the other hand, when people are arrested for meth possession, the personal and social penalties, imprisonment, job loss, public disgrace, are severe, and recidivism is not uncommon because the social reintegration mechanisms are weak. The Japanese case illustrates a truth about punitive regimes. They can keep visible prevalence low while exacting a heavy toll on a smaller group of people. Southeast Asia's experience has been more openly explosive. The Yaba phenomenon, tablets of methamphetamine often mixed with caffeine, spread across Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar with a rapidity that mirrored the land's porous borders and age economies. The Golden Triangle, once synonymous with opium and heroin production, reinvented itself again for meth. Militias, insurgent armies, and shadow economies built production infrastructure in the isolated hills of Shan State in Myanmar. By the mid-2010s, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime reported seizures and production that dwarfed earlier eras, with tablets moving to urban centres and regional capitals. Thailand, which in 2003 launched a brutal and much criticised war on drugs under Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra that included extrajudicial killings, oscillated afterward between heavy-handed enforcement and pragmatic harm reduction to deal with the fallout. The region shows how production adapts to opportunity and how violent crackdowns can produce humanitarian crises without eliminating markets. Mexico's role in the methamphetamine story is architectural in scale. It is where production and transit combined into an industrial enterprise that furnished the North American market. Mexican cartels, Sinaloa, Jalisco, New Generation and others, adapted to US precursor restrictions by building upstream chemical networks and large processing facilities. The aftermath of the US Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act was predictable in the way market adaptations often are. Reductions in small domestic labs in the United States translated into greater imports, purer products, and organized criminal involvement across borders. The Mexican state's own oscillation, from local policing to the militarized campaign under President Felipe Calderon beginning in 2006, which sought to decapitate cartels through force, produced an explosion of violence that eclipsed public health concerns. The ensuing years exposed the limits of supply-side remedies when they are waged without a parallel expansion in demand reduction strategies and social investment. Australia's ice crisis of the 2010s forced a re-evaluation of policy. The crystalline form of methamphetamine, potent, smokable, socially disruptive, rose in visibility in cities and rural towns alike. The federal government's 2015 National Ice Task Force reported widely and recommended a blend of measures: a stronger treatment workforce, more research into pharmacotherapies, investment in diversion programs, and targeted law enforcement against traffickers. Australia's long-standing commitment to harm minimisation, for example needle and syringe programs since the 80s and the medically supervised injecting centre in Sydney established in 2001, softened some harms, but the scale of meth's social impact, psychosis admissions, family breakdown and police workloads, demanded more than needle exchanges could deliver. The Australian story underscores the political hazards that comes with sudden spikes in visible harm. Once a crisis is framed in moral panic, resource allocation tends toward emergency policing rather than steady capacity building. The United States finally provides a case study in regional variability. Methamphetamine's epidemic has been uneven, episodic and adaptive. In the 90s and early 2000s, the American West and Midwest saw high rates of meth involving numerous small domestic labs. The 2005 federal restrictions moved the locus of production southward and changed the commodity's characteristics, purer, more crystalline, with consequences for patterns of use and harm. In the 2010s, meth combined tragically with the opioid crisis. Fentanyl contamination of stimulant supplies produced sharp increases in fatal overdoses among populations that had not previously experienced opioid-related mortality at the same scale. Regions such as Appalachia and parts of the rural Midwest experienced overlapping epidemics of meth use, economic decline, and insufficient access to care. The US response has been a collage. Some cities expanded syringe exchanges and naloxone distribution. Some counties increased drug court capacity. Some states restricted pseudoephedrine sales beyond the federal baseline, and others doubled down on enforcement. What do these comparative cases teach us about policy? First, context matters. Japan's heavy-handed, stigma-driven containment is not an easily transferable model to Myanmar or to Mexico. Cultural dynamics, governance capacity, and social safety nets shape what interventions will fly. Second, enforcement works at the margin. Targeted law enforcement against violent traffickers and large-scale production facilities is a necessary tool. It is not sufficient. Supply-focused policies often displace harm rather than extinguish it, unless they are embedded in a broader strategy that includes demand reduction and social investment. Third, harm reduction measures are transportable, evidence-based and politically contested, but where implemented they produce measurable public health benefits. Fourth, treatment and recovery programs must be integrated into social services, housing, employment, mental health care. Last, international collaboration on precursor control is vital and complicated. Attempts to choke off chemical supplies can be effective, but only when paired with robust international monitoring, and when sourcing nations are willing to regulate chemical industries. Otherwise, the trafficking adapts. Barriers to this integrative vision are not ideological alone, they are institutional. Ministries of health and ministries of justice speak different bureaucratic languages in answer to different voter logics. Law enforcement thrives on simple and visible victories. Health ministries count incremental health gains that rarely make headlines. International treaties like the Methamphetamine Convention on Psychotropic Substances and the 1988 UN Convention against Illicit Traffic embed criminalisation into global law in ways that can complicate novel national experiments like Portugal's decriminalisation. Corruption and violent competition for illicit rents blunt cross-border cooperation in regions where governance is fragile. And stigma, a social architecture that assigns moral failure to addiction, erodes political support for policies that are pragmatic and to some counterintuitive. If anything in this long chapter is gently hopeful, it is the scope for pragmatic combination. A community that invests in school-based prevention and family support, that funds contingency management and CBT, that provides housing, peer support and syringe exchange, that pursues targeted law enforcement against violent and large-scale producers, and that pursues international agreements to monitor and regulate precursor chemicals will, on balance, reduce harm. It is a gardening metaphor. Pull the weeds where they choke everything. Tend the soil by funding healthcare and housing. Plant seeds of prevention early. It is not an overnight transformation. Gardens are patient work. Across the arc from punishment to prevention and then into recovery and comparative geography, one persistent truth remains. Policy is not magic. It cannot unmake chemistry. And it cannot simply will away the historical conditions, wars, poverty, displacement, inequality that make stimulants attractive to some people. It can, however, change the terms of risk and the texture of care. The evidence favours policies that treat methamphetamine not merely as a criminal problem, but as a chronic, treatable public health issue, one that responds best to a combination of modest, evidence-based clinical practices and solid investments in social infrastructure. That is the lesson of places like Portugal and Vancouver and some parts of Australia. It is also the stubborn lesson of places where punitive action, without proportional care, produced cycles of harm. The super soldier dream that once animated military laboratories has evaporated into an altogether different human problem. How to reduce suffering and rebuild lives when a drug that promised endurance delivered erosion. In the quiet work of clinics, peer support meetings, supervised rooms and family interventions, there are small, empirically grounded victories that do not always attract the cameras. In the louder theatres of politics, policymakers will continue to prefer tidy metrics, seizures, arrests, and occasional high-profile indictments. The history of methamphetamine teaches a humbling truth about scale, that the epidemic's curve is shaped as much by chemistry as by cultural choices and policy architectures, and a practical truth about strategy. Mix the care with the clamps, invest in the people we wish to help, and measure what matters to human flourishing. If you imagine a policymaker tucking this problem in like a child at the end of a long day, perhaps their best acts will be gentle. Close the door on punitive excess, smooth the blanket of services across the bed of need, and leave the light on for the slow, steady work of recovery. When the camera found methamphetamine, it rarely found nuance, it found spectacle, and it found bodies that could be photographed and shown in the stark, high-contrast light that sells outrage. Local television news learned early that a story about a meth lab could be paced like a thriller. A shaky shot of glassware in a dingy trailer. The burned-out countertop where chemistry met desperation. The hazard suit rapping of police technicians. The shrill voice of a sheriff who promised, with a practiced solemnity, that he had never seen anything like it, and then another sheriff from the next county over promising the same. Those images became shorthand. They still come to mind, the beakers and the bleach-suffused razors, the orange-splattered countertops, the children's toys in the background, the apocalyptic before and after portraits of faces that the reader or viewer could interpret without a caption. They taught millions how to feel about meth, fear, disgust, moral indignation, and that thing in turn made policy. The story of how journalism, film and politics conspired to shape both panic and policy is an old one. In the United States, the local television news habits of the 1980s and 90s met meth's resurgent public profile in the 90s, and especially the early 2000s, and the result was a moral economy of images. National pundits and editorial pages seized on the meth lab as a symbol of rural degeneration, of a new and insidious rural crime that did not fit old stereotypes of urban drug use. The first years of the 21st century produced a steady stream of front-page, late-night, and tabloid-friendly stories. Sensational raids, fibre-optic photos of synthetic equipment, breathless interviews with witnesses who had smelled the solvent and called the police. In 2005, when legislatures debated the tightening of pseudoephedrine sales, when a federal law in the United States placed restrictions on cold medicines and pushed them behind pharmacy counters, the language and images of those broadcasts were part of the substrate that made political action seem urgent and reasonable. The policy was not made in the television studio and, of course, had multiple rationales, but it was made in a climate of public fear that the press had stoked, and that politicians, eager to be seen doing something about the meth menace, were happy to exploit. Film and television played a subtler but no less powerful role. Documentary producers and reality television, shows like Intervention that began airing in the mid-2000s, brought raw, intimate portraits of addiction into American living rooms. Cutting documentaries framed individual stories, the young mother, the father in and out of treatment, the jail-bound partner as moral drama, and those narratives reinforced a sense of meth use as not only criminal but deeply degenerative in a way that accentuated moral blame. Fictional drama complicated that picture, but not always in the way the clinicians and harm reduction advocates hoped. Breaking Bad, which began in 2008 and ran until 2013, turned the making of meth into an allegory of American hubris and commerce. It was, in places, telling and humane, and in others undeniably entertaining. The show elevated the meth cook to an anti-hero and made viewers comfortable with the idea that someone could be both brilliant and monstrous. That moral complication was good drama. It was not always good public education. Beyond drama and documentary, there were smaller cultural currents that left indelible marks. Pop songs and stand-up local theatre and small documentaries produced in places like Minnesota, Iowa, and rural Australia. In Thailand and across parts of Southeast Asia, the tabloids wrapped methamphetamine in a different set of images. The tablet known as yaba, bright red or pink, was seen on buses, in the hands of teenagers, on the lips of politicians who thundered about cultural collapse. In the Philippines, the term shabu is spoken in a tone that makes it sound like a curse, and in 2016 the election of Rodrigo Duterte transformed public rhetoric into a literal war on drug users, where mass extrajudicial violence became alarmingly entangled with national policy. Duterte was not inventing public disgust. He was riding a wave, but he turbocharged it, and the international press carried images of nightly death squads and televised confessionals that deepened public fears and hardened policy responses in other places, where political leaders took a lesson in showmanship and rhetorical severity. What the media did almost everywhere was to simplify addiction into a story of individual moral failure and outrage-inducing spectacle. The narrative was irresistible, an otherwise ordinary town ruined by a sudden influx of meth cookers. A mother with sunken cheeks, mouth scarred and teeth rotting, a photo that could be used without the context of poverty, dental care deficits, sugary drinks, and a lifetime of neglect. Meth mouth became shorthand. Photographers and newsrooms loved it. Politicians loved it. It was a simple, visible horror that needed a simple answer. More policing, bans on precursors, and tougher sentencing. The public liked those answers. Laws followed. There were consequences that images did not show. Policy directed by spectacle shaped enforcement priorities and, in so doing, constrained the options for health-based responses. When the centre of attention was the makeshift lab, law enforcement budgets grew for hazardous materials teams and regional investigative squads. Judges and prosecutors found headline-friendly cases. Public health strategies, the slow, unsexy work of building clinics, training counsellors, funding long-term housing and employment programs, tended to be underfunded. Harm reduction programs struggled under the weight of the narrative. When voters saw the meth story as one of moral filth, they were less likely to vote to fund syringe exchanges, safer consumption spaces, or contingency management programs that offered vouchers as incentives for treatment adherence. In parts of rural America, community opposition blocked needle exchanges and the expansion of treatment centres. In Australia, throughout the 2000s and 2010s, sensational reporting about ICE helped legitimate harsh policing measures and stymied more progressive harm reduction initiatives in some states. The effect was global. A public appetite for punishment often proved an inhospitable host for programs that treat addiction as a medical and social problem. Stigma, once constructed, proved remarkably adherent. It operates like a dust that settles into institutional crevices. Medical students and junior clinicians, when trained in a context where meth users are presented through bad photographs and scandalized case reports, absorbed an effective bias, a wariness, a moral judgment, a readiness to see non-compliance rather than pathology. Social services were pressured to distance themselves from meth houses. Housing authorities, fearing media exposure and voter anger, were more likely to evict tenants who use substances or to refuse housing to people with drug convictions. Insurance programs and public funders, after political battles over the cost of drug treatment, often prioritized opioid use disorder. A rational shift once overdose deaths from synthetic opioids exploded in the 2010s, but a shift that left stimulant disorders relatively ignored. The result across nations and systems was predictable. Treatment systems mismatched demand, punitive responses crowded out supportive ones, and many people who needed help were pushed further into hiding. They did not come to clinics. They did not seek care. They died or cycled in and out of jails. Journalists and filmmakers bear responsibility for some of this, but not all. They report what sells, and they bring stories to publics who then demand action. The political machinery, the legislatures and executives that respond, are the ones who translate outrage into law. Some politicians, more cynically, weaponize images to deflect attention from other failures. Broken schools, collapsed industries, failing health systems. A mayor can promise a meth crackdown in a soundbite and forego the far costlier work of building affordable housing and mental health capacity. This is the crucial and cruel arithmetic of images and incentives. A 30-second television segment can win an election. A decade of public health investment cannot. Thus, stigma metamorphoses into a policy compass that points invariably toward punishment and away from care. If one shifts the camera lens from media to science, the picture becomes more complicated and less cinematic. The laboratories and clinics that study methamphetamine use disorder are quieter places. They are laboratories of behaviour and brain imaging rooms humming with MRI machines, not the picturesque lab bust photos that sell papers. In those spaces, researchers have pursued therapies that are modest in glamour but profound in potential. Behavioural science has been the most reliable compass. Cognitive behavioural therapy adapted for stimulant use, motivational interviewing, the matrix model developed for stimulant treatment in the United States in the 80s and 1990s, and contingency management, a technique in which tangible rewards are used to reinforce abstinence or engagement in treatment. have produced reproducible benefits in randomized trials. The psychologist Nancy M. Petrie, whose work from the late 1990s into the 2010s marshalled strong evidence for contingency management, made an institutional case for scaling rewards-based approaches in clinics. These interventions are not glamorous. They do not fit neatly into simple political narratives, but they work. Contingency management in particular has some of the most robust effect sizes for reducing stimulant use. It is as if the simplest economics, brief material rewards, can virtually reprice behavior in favor of health. Yet even such successes have been hamstrung by policy and programmatic obstacles. Laws and regulations against paying people to do something have, in some nations, been interpreted to exclude many forms of contingency management. Stigma and political reluctance have kept clinics from adopting it at scale. When clinics do try it, funding is often precarious. Pharmacology has offered more tantalizing promises and equally deeper disappointments. As of mid-2024, there is no universally accepted, approved medication that cures methamphetamine use disorder. Researchers have tested a catalogue of agents, stimulants borrowed from other medical uses such as methylphenidate or dextroamphetamine in substitution models, antidepressants like bupropion, wakefulness-promoting agents like modafinil, anticonvulsants such as topiramate, antidepressant noradrenergic agents like mirtazapine in targeted populations, opioid antagonists such as naltrexone, and novel compounds that tinker with glutamate and other systems implicated in reward and habit. Results have been mixed. Some trials showed modest reductions in use, especially in subgroups of patients selected by severity or co-occurring conditions. Others failed to find significant differences versus placebo. The heterogeneity of outcomes speaks to a core challenge. Methamphetamine use disorder is not a single biological lesion, but a tangled syndrome of neurochemical change, psychosocial stresses, comorbid mental illness, and structural disadvantage. A medication that reduces craving by a biochemical mechanism does not, on its own, rebuild a life that has been eroded by unemployment, homelessness, and trauma. More experimental approaches have surfaced in the last 2 decades. Immunotherapies, including vaccines designed to elicit antibodies that bind methamphetamine in the bloodstream and prevent it from reaching the brain, looked promising in rodent and primate studies. They are elegant in concept. If the drug cannot enter the central nervous system, its reinforcement is blunted, but the immunological variability in humans, the logistical challenges of booster doses, and the ethical questions about their use in coerced or criminal justice contexts have slowed progress. Monoclonal antibodies, administered passively, offer a more controllable intervention, and biotech firms and academic teams have advanced candidate molecules into early human testing. They are particularly intriguing as emergency interventions to blunt overdoses or to provide short-term bridges away from use, but production cost, duration of effect and the need for repeated dosing remain hurdles. Neuromodulation has moved from the realm of theoretical curiosity into small clinical trials. Repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, RTMS, usually targeted to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, has shown promise in small randomized and sham-controlled trials conducted in places as far apart as Australia, China, and the United States. The results are not uniformly transformative, but they are suggestive. Reductions in craving, modest decreases in use, and in some studies improvements that endure beyond stimulation sessions. Transcranial direct current stimulation, TDCS, and invasive approaches like deep brain stimulation, DBS, have been tried in extraordinarily refractory cases. DBS remains experimental and ethically fraught, reserved for the most severe patients whose lives have been reduced to nothing and for whom all other options have failed. In liver and spleen clinics and university research centres alike, these approaches are being advanced with caution, measured expectation, and the recurrent reminder that technological fixes cannot replace social supports. One of the most important contemporary lessons from the laboratory bench is the need for integrated, person-centered care and pragmatic trials that test not just a drug or a device, but systems of care. Trials that embed contingency management into community clinics, that combine pharmacotherapy with sustained psychotherapy and housing supports produce better outcomes than the same pharmacological agent tested in a clinical vacuum. Implementation science, the study of how to make effective treatments work in real-world settings, has become as important as any Phase 2 pharmacology trial. It is evidence of an epistemic shift. The field increasingly recognises that the pace of impact will depend as much on health systems and social policies as on molecules. Yet science is also a function of funding, and funding is political. For much of the first 2 decades of the 2000s, research funding followed the headlines. The opioid epidemic of the 2010s drew massive investments toward opioid pharmacotherapies, overdose prevention, and naloxone distribution. Stimulant research, comparatively neglected, limped along on smaller grants. That mismatch of resources matters. It means fewer large, definitive trials, fewer multi-site studies that can test whether an observed effect is robust across geography and populations, and less capacity to translate promising prototypes, vaccines, monoclonal therapies, neuromodulation into scalable programs. It means that the next decade's breakthroughs may arrive slowly, and that the people most harmed in the present may not benefit. There are also ethical knots to untangle. Vaccines that blunt a drug's effect carry the risk of being presented as solutions for those the state deems unfit, particularly in criminal justice systems that have historically used forced medicalization. Coercion in such contexts is a real danger. The line between offering treatment and mandating it can be thin, and the history of addiction policy is awash in experiments that began in good faith and ended in moral disaster. Trials of neuromodulatory devices and invasive techniques must consider long-term effects on autonomy, personality, and consent. Researchers, ethicists, and communities must collaborate, and the people with lived experience of methamphetamine use must be partners in designing the studies that will affect them. After decades of the bitter, pragmatic, and sometimes halting work, the lessons of history become quite plain, and the policy choices they suggest are simple in outline if complex in execution. First, public health must displace punishment as the primary axis of policy. This is not an abstract ideal, it is an empirical claim grounded in comparisons across nations and decades. Portugal's decriminalisation and its redirection of resources toward treatment and social support since 2001 offers one model: fewer newly incarcerated people living with substance use disorders, increased uptake of treatment services, and a public health framing that allowed needle exchanges, opioid substitution programs, and targeted outreach to take root. It is not a perfect model, nor is it a turnkey export, but it illustrates an essential principle. Criminalization amplifies stigma and erects practical barriers to care. Second, harm reduction must be scaled, diversified, and normalized. Syringe service programs, safe consumption spaces, drug checking services, and distribution of testing strips for fentanyl are, despite moral panic, pragmatic tools that reduce infection, overdose, and death. These interventions are often opposed precisely because they make invisible the comforting moral clarity of punishment. They are, in a sense, boringly effective. Governments that want to reduce the social cost of methamphetamine use should expand such services, and they should do so with attention to local culture and law. In the United States, this means working across state lines to harmonize policies so that a person in a rural county has the same basic harm reduction options as someone in a city. Third, treatment must be scaled and diversified. We must fund widespread adoption of contingency management in public clinics, remove regulatory barriers that prevent its use, and invest in training an expanded workforce. Counsellors, community health workers, peer supporters with lived experience. Behavioural therapies must be reimbursed adequately, and clinics should be encouraged to integrate housing and employment services into treatment models. The therapeutic architecture must be built to be long-term and low-threshold. drop-in care, flexible hours, telehealth, and mobile units that can reach dispersed rural populations. Stigma makes people lie to clinicians and avoid services. Accessible, non-judgmental clinics address this directly. Fourth, research must be prioritized strategically. That means large multi-site trials, particularly of promising pharmacotherapies and neuromodulatory techniques that are powered to detect clinically meaningful effects across diverse populations. It also means funding implementation science so that we know how to scale what works and uncover the real barriers in clinics and communities. It means community involvement in research design and safeguards to prevent coercive or inequitable application of new biomedical tools. And it requires international coordination. No nation can vaccinate or fortify its way out of a supply chain that moves precursor chemicals across borders. Fifth, socio-economic root causes must be addressed. Addiction feeds on dislocation, the loss of steady work, crumbling social safety nets, the erosion of community institutions. The drug itself is only the last step in a long chain. Policies to prevent future epidemics must therefore be wide. Investments in education, decent employment, stable housing, mental health care, early childhood supports, and trauma-informed services. Prevention is not simply a slogan. It is structural. Better schools in remote towns, more opportunities for young people without college degrees, mental health teams in primary care clinics. Finally, we must remake the story. The most important single lever we have is narrative. Media and political actors who continue to use lurid images as the basis for policy contribute to cycles of punishment and neglect. Journalists and filmmakers can insist on complexity without abdicating the power of images. They can include the voices of people who have recovered, of families who have found care, of providers who can speak in plain terms, effective interventions. Policymakers can insist that public campaigns highlight recovery and the social determinants of addiction rather than only the worst, most terrifying cases. Language matters, person-centered language, unstigmatizing terms, images that do not reduce people to a pathology of face and teeth. All of these reduce the social predictability of punishment and open space for treatment. If we walk back through the long history of methamphetamine, from Pervitin pills in the Wehrmacht barracks of 1938 Germany to the bureaucratic shelves of pharmacies in the mid-2000s United States, from Yaba tablets rolling off presses in Myanmar and Thailand to the Shabu raids and extrajudicial killings that marked the Philippines in the late 2010s, from the crystal ice dens of urban Australia to the rural trailer park labs that made headlines in the American Midwest, we see a repeated pattern. A technological fix is discovered or repurposed for utility. It escapes medical control. It flows into popular markets. Politicians and journalists spot a story. Public fear swells. Unitive policy follows. And people pay the heaviest price. The melody is the same decade after decade. The instruments change. The song remains. The map forward is not simple, but it is knowable. It requires humility from politicians who must learn that the applause of a tough-sounding speech is easy. The slow approval of a funded needle exchange is harder. It requires discipline from scientists who must balance hope with rigor, and from funders who must invest in long horizons. It requires courage from communities convicted by their worst photographs to accept programs that may initially offend their sensibilities, but that will, if properly managed, keep people alive. It requires above all a moral recalibration, an acceptance that addiction is a social disease as much as a neurochemical one, and that our best defences are community institutions, not incarceration. History teaches another quiet, almost consoling lesson. Human responses to drugs evolve. The same chemical that once seemed useful to commanders hoping to keep troops awake and obedient later became the engine of private misery. The same nation that built prohibitionist systems has, in some places, learned how to build humane alternatives. Nothing about that arc is guaranteed. The next novel stimulant, the next synthetic variant that slips unnoticed across a border, presents us with a new problem, but we will not be helpless if we remember what has worked. public health, harm reduction, social equity, and sustained scientific inquiry that is embedded in the realities of people's lives. So the final and perhaps strangest irony is this. The drug once pitched as a way to make better soldiers taught the world how fragile are the instruments of social control. It taught us painfully that the strategies of criminalization tend to propagate the very harms they seek to solve. If we are to prevent a repeat, and the history says repeats are the default, we have to change the instruments. We have to change the frame. We have to change the narrative. We must put our dollars where our morals can be tested. In clinics, in housing, in the steady work of making communities resilient. That is boring work in a way. It offers no overnight headlines. It is patient, quiet, and granular. It is also, in the long run, the only real way to keep people alive, to reduce suffering, and to ensure that a substance that began its public life as a tool of war does not become the endless fuel of a peacetime plague.